Oh man, I've got a game this weekend and I really have to get this model painted. Said a lot of people, but not me, usually. I've never really understood the panic about getting models painted for an upcoming game, but I'll talk through that in a moment because I actually do have a game coming up. And not just a public pickup, but actually a game that I'm running, and actually a game that I wrote. You see, this is a jet bike for my jet bike racing game, and I would really like it to look pretty good for when we play. Specifically, this model is from Mantic Games and is an Enforcers model. It's currently primed with a supposedly tan colour, although I consider it more of a browny off-white. The real issue, unfortunately, is that this was the dregs of the can that I used, and it's come out with a far smoother surface than it really should, and that will come up later on, but I'm going to get stuck in to painting it first. As I'm leaning towards getting this model painted fairly quickly, I have a few quick techniques to get a lot of the boring work done quickly, and later on I'll spend just the time needed for some prominent effects to make the model look good. I should have dry brushed these first few layers, and that would have been quite a bit quicker, but I guess I've just got used to the idea of base coating with the airbrush. I'm undershooting with a darker brown first, as this will provide a nice shadow colour, but I'm only going a little up the sides of the jet bike at the moment, and I'm not putting any of this darker colour on top, not doing a total coat. And this is so that when I put the red from the top, it has the best chance to be nice and bright directly over a light primer colour. I even emphasise this on the main centre fairing piece at the front, just in front of where the rider sits, by putting several coats of red here to ensure that is a prominent bright red. Going from the brown underneath to the red around most of the top to the solid red on this front point is an easy way to create some visual definition to the model within a fairly short time frame. Again, this would have been quicker with a dry brush, and that also would have added some nice texture as well. I mentioned that I'll be using a lot of quick techniques, but in this step I'm going to take a little bit of time to apply a technique that might be slightly slower, but gives a lot of definition and is therefore quite efficient. And this is an early panel lining. Usually panel lining happens at the end of a paint job to create very strong dark lines separating all of the segments of a model. However, by applying these lines early, I can work a little quicker, a little messier perhaps, because the later steps are going to naturally neaten this up. And it's while I was painting these lines that I realised the slightly absurd idea behind the concept of I must have this model painted by this weekend mentality that I do see quite a lot in particularly wargamers who paint models. Sure, it's nice to have a painted model or a fully painted army depending on what game you're playing, but it's hardly a requirement. Playing with a part painted or unpainted model is a long-standing tradition in our hobby and should always be encouraged. Not everyone has the time to paint every single model to some unfairly high painting standard. My rule is that so long as your opponent can tell what the model is meant to represent, that's enough. Glue the arms on with the right equipment, glue the vehicle together, that's all that is needed. I knew my model would have a few prominent areas of different colours to be striking, but also to make it quick and easy for me to paint. Most of the bike would be red and the rider would probably be darker, but I wanted a strong contrast on a couple of pieces of the bike itself. I chose a nice light grey blue. I've always liked this particular paint, and I applied it in a number of layers to a few choice parts of the fairing. I realised that this would actually take a while to do. This paint is naturally quite translucent, and I really wanted a bold solid coat for the effect that I wanted, and that would take quite a few layers. And once I'd done that, I'd have to reapply the panel lining as well. But by choosing specific locations to paint in this blue-grey and sticking to that, even when I looked at some other places that I might have liked to paint in this colour, I was able to keep this time to a reasonable level. When painting model vehicles in similar techniques, I often spend a long time picking out details, whether it's access panels, warning labels, unit markings, stowage weapons, all sorts of stuff. This time I have to be quicker, and so I'm just picking out the most important prominent things. So in silver, I'm going to paint the engine, and at the front, on the original model, this would have been a weapon, but for a racing vehicle, you might consider this an intake for the engine, or some kind of sensor, airspeed thingamidoodah that might exist on this kind of thing. And then, naturally, a wash. We all know the use of a wash. Used to darken everything as a filter, and is very low effort and low time input to have quite a strong, prominent effect. You may wonder why I do that panel line and a wash, as they do kind of overlap. But by overlapping here, I'm making those original lines extremely prominent, but also smoothing the edges down, which means I can save time on both the panel line and also the other techniques that I might like to use otherwise. At this stage, I usually get stuck into an edge highlight, painting along the physical edges of all of the features of the model to emphasize their shape. However, I've recently been looking at what I've kind of been referring to as an in-edge highlight. Instead of painting along the physical edge, I'm painting a line just inset from the edge, which has a very similar look, but in my opinion a more cartoony effect, like a comic book robot, which is certainly a striking effect that might just give the overall model a look that I like. And this is the first time that I've tried it out myself, and you can tell me in the comments what you think about it. In terms of speed, I have no idea if this is faster or slower than my usual edge highlight, but as it's my first attempt, I'm certainly not as neat as I could be, with a lot of my in edges straying all the way up to the physical edge of the model. It's just a slightly different technique that gives a slightly different effect, and I wanted to try it out. Overall, to keep my eye on the total time running for this model, I'm going to call the jet bike itself done at this point and move on to the rider. And this is where things make an awkward turn for the slightly more annoying. The primer, as I mentioned earlier, came out with a slightly glossy effect, causing almost all of the issues coming up that you can quite clearly see. I know I wanted a darker rider compared to the bike, and why not go all the way to black? And my first layer of black was unsuccessful, but just enough paint stuck to most of the model that it became matte enough for my future layers to stick, sort of, mostly. And I added several more layers of black, which is something that you really don't do very often, because black usually goes down pretty heavily in one thin coat. But I did follow along using my in-edge highlight, or I guess it's not a highlight, but an in-edge shadow in this case. And this actually left the tan primer as its own natural edge highlight. Although overall, I don't really like this effect and how it was working. And so I was struggling with how I wanted to detail the rider as well. I looked at some real sports bikers and what their armour looks like, and so I went with some red stripes down the leg, highlighted a little with some orange, and then I started just painting in red and orange pieces over the other parts of the biker. But at some point I realised that it just wasn't working for me. I just thought it looked terrible, and so I left it and moved on to the helmet. I've always liked the aesthetic of a helmet being a different colour to the rest of the armour. Real bikers like myself often do this for visibility as a safety feature, and it just looks cool. I used the last of my blue-grey from my wet palette and added some white for, again, in-edge highlighting, although the pieces of the helmet are kind of tiny, so it's not that noticeable. With the smallest, finest black lining on the whole model and a nice big red stripe down the middle, that was by far the best looking part of the rider, and it kind of reminds everyone who I've shown these images to of a Space Marine sergeant. Yuck. So now here comes the choice. I could spend a lot of time paint stripping, repriming, repainting the biker all over again, and I'd almost certainly be able to do a better job with a better understanding of an art direction that I would want to go in. Or I accept that it looks like it looks. It is painted, and I can use it in a game just like this. Honestly, it doesn't look that bad. It's by far not my best work, but it is painted, and he looks fairly alright once he's on the bike. For a gaming piece, something to represent a player's high-speed sporting vehicle, I think it's plenty good enough. And there is a disconnect between a gaming piece and a display piece. So, for anyone else with a game coming up, go play with unpainted models if needed, because games are fun. But at the same time, if you do get enough time to put some paint down, do that, because painting is enjoyable in its own way. Well, I have a game I've got to get off to, so I'll just say, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.